It often begins in a place most people ignore, the quiet disturbance within. Nothing dramatic has happened yet, no clear betrayal, no undeniable proof. And yet, something in you no longer rests the way it once did. Where there was ease, there is now tension. Where there was warmth, there is now a subtle resistance. You may try to dismiss it, rationalize it, even blame your own sensitivity. But this shift is not random. Psychologically, the human mind is far more perceptive than we give it credit for. Long before conscious awareness catches up, the unconscious begins registering patterns, micro behaviors, inconsistencies, emotional dissonance. You start to feel drained after interactions you once enjoyed. Conversations that should feel simple begin to carry an invisible weight. You leave feeling slightly diminished, though you cannot fully explain why. This is what happens when your inner world begins to recognize a misalignment that your conscious mind is not yet ready to accept. The psyche resists what the ego tries to maintain, and so a quiet unrest emerges, not loud enough to force immediate action, but persistent enough that it cannot be silenced. What makes this stage so critical is that many choose to ignore it. They override their intuition in favor of attachment, familiarity, or the hope that things will return to how they once were. But peace does not withdraw without reason. When your internal sense of calm begins to erode in someone's presence, it is often because something deeper is being violated. Your boundaries, your values, or your sense of self. In many ways, this is the first warning. Not delivered through words, but through feeling. And feelings, when observed carefully, are rarely deceptive. They are signals, subtle, intelligent, and deeply connected to truth. The question is not whether the warning is there. The question is whether you are willing to listen to it before it becomes impossible to ignore. Because the moment you lose peace, you are already being shown what you will eventually be forced to accept. Following that quiet loss of peace, something even more destabilizing begins to take hold. Your sense of clarity starts to erode. What once felt straightforward now feels tangled. You find yourself replaying conversations, analyzing tone, questioning meaning. Simple interactions become puzzles you cannot quite solve. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, you begin to doubt your own perception. This is not accidental. When confusion replaces clarity, it often signals a deeper psychological disturbance in the dynamic itself. You may be told one thing, then shown another. Words and actions no longer align, and yet, when you try to address it, the response you receive only deepens your uncertainty. You are left not with answers, but with more questions. Over time, this creates a state of internal fragmentation. One part of you senses that something is wrong, while another part struggles to justify and maintain the connection. What is important to understand here is that the human mind seeks coherence. We are wired to make sense of our experiences, to build a stable narrative of reality. When that narrative is constantly disrupted, it creates cognitive strain. You may begin to feel mentally exhausted, not because of what is happening externally, but because of the constant effort to internally reconcile contradictions that should not exist in the first place. And so, you start to turn inward in a destructive way. Instead of questioning the situation, you question yourself. Perhaps you are overthinking. Perhaps you are too sensitive. Perhaps you are the problem. This is the subtle turning point where clarity is not just lost, it is inverted. But confusion, when persistent, is rarely a reflection of truth. Truth has a certain simplicity to it, even when it is painful. It does not require endless mental gymnastics to sustain itself. When you find yourself consistently disoriented in someone's presence, it is not a failure of your intelligence. It is a signal that something in the dynamic is fundamentally misaligned. Clarity does not vanish without cause. When your reality begins to feel uncertain, it is often because you are being pulled away from it. As clarity continues to dissolve, another signal emerges, one that is far more difficult to ignore, because it is felt not just in the mind, but in the body. Your energy begins to decline. What once felt manageable now feels heavy. Interactions that should uplift you instead leave you depleted. And no matter how much effort you invest, there is a lingering sense that it is never enough. This exhaustion is not simply the result of external demands. It is the consequence of internal conflict. When you are constantly navigating confusion, suppressing intuition, and attempting to preserve something that no longer feels stable, the psyche is forced into a state of overexertion. You are, in a sense, working against yourself. One part of you is trying to maintain the connection, while another part is quietly resisting it. That tension consumes energy at a profound level. You may notice subtle changes at first: a loss of enthusiasm, a reluctance to engage, a feeling of emotional fatigue that lingers long after the interaction ends. Over time, this can extend further into your focus, your motivation, even your physical well-being. Sleep may feel less restorative. Your thoughts become heavier. What once brought you joy begins to feel distant. It is important to recognize that energy is not just a physical resource. It is deeply tied to meaning. When you are investing yourself into something that lacks reciprocity, authenticity, or stability, your system begins to withdraw, not out of weakness, but as a form of protection. The depletion you feel is not a failure, it is feedback. And yet, many people misinterpret this signal. They believe they need to try harder, give more, fix what is broken. But energy does not restore itself through forced effort in a misaligned environment. It recovers through truth, through alignment, through the willingness to confront what is actually taking place. When your energy consistently declines in someone's presence, it is not asking for more effort. It is asking for awareness. Because the moment something begins to drain your spirit, it is already revealing that it was never meant to sustain you. As this depletion deepens, something even more concerning begins to unfold. Your sense of self starts to shift, not in a way that reflects growth or evolution, but in a way that feels like erosion. You begin to notice that you are no longer showing up as the person you once were. Your responses become more cautious, your voice less certain, your presence more restrained. It is as though you are gradually editing yourself in order to maintain the connection. This is not a conscious decision at first. It happens subtly. You start avoiding certain topics because they lead to conflict. You suppress reactions because expressing them feels unsafe or futile. You adjust your behavior, your tone, even your values in small ways, believing that this adaptation will restore harmony. But harmony built on abandonment is not harmony, it is quiet submission. From a psychological perspective, this reflects a fragmentation of identity. The self is no longer operating as a unified whole. Instead, it becomes divided, one part seeking authenticity, the other seeking acceptance at any cost. Over time, the part of you that strives for truth becomes weaker, while the part that adapts becomes dominant. And with that shift, your confidence begins to fade. You may find yourself seeking validation where you once stood firm in your own understanding. Decisions that used to come naturally now feel uncertain. You hesitate, you second guess, you look outward for reassurance. This is not because you have lost your capacity for clarity, but because you have been distanced from it. What makes this stage particularly dangerous is that it often goes unrecognized. You may still believe you are in control, that you are simply being patient or understanding. But the gradual loss of identity does not announce itself loudly. It reveals itself in what you no longer express, in what you no longer defend, in who you are slowly becoming. And yet, the self does not disappear entirely. It waits. It observes. It leaves traces, moments of discomfort, flashes of awareness, a quiet recognition that something is not right. Because the moment you have to lose yourself to keep someone, you are no longer in a relationship. You are in a surrender.
And as this quiet surrender continues, a pattern begins to reveal itself, one that is far less subtle than the earlier signs. You start to notice repetition. The same conflicts arise, the same apologies are offered, the same promises are made, and yet nothing fundamentally changes. It is not a single moment of disrespect that defines the experience, but the cycle of it. At first, each incident may seem isolated. You may believe it was a misunderstanding, a bad day, an emotional reaction that will pass. And when an apology follows, it creates a temporary sense of resolution. You want to believe it because belief sustains the connection. But over time, the pattern becomes undeniable. The apology begins to feel less like accountability and more like a mechanism to reset the cycle. Psychologically, repetition is never meaningless. When a behavior persists despite acknowledgement, it reveals intention at a deeper level, not necessarily conscious malice, but a lack of genuine transformation. Words may suggest awareness, but actions reveal truth. And when those actions remain unchanged, they begin to erode trust, not only in the other person, but in your own willingness to see clearly. This is where many people become trapped. They focus on the moments of remorse rather than the consistency of behavior. They measure the relationship by its temporary highs instead of its recurring lows, and in doing so, they remain attached to potential rather than reality. What is essential to understand is that patterns are not accidents. They are expressions of what is stable within a person. Anyone can apologize, anyone can promise change, but transformation is reflected in consistency, not in isolated gestures. When the same form of disrespect continues to surface, it is no longer a mistake. It is a message, and that message is not simply about the other person. It is also about what you are willing to tolerate, what you continue to excuse, what you are unconsciously agreeing to by remaining present in the cycle. Because the moment a pattern repeats without change, it is no longer testing your patience, it is revealing your boundaries. And after all of this, the loss of peace, the erosion of clarity, the depletion of energy, the quiet fading of your identity, and the undeniable repetition of patterns, something begins to surface with a different kind of authority. It is not loud. It does not argue. It does not try to convince you. It simply knows. A quiet inner voice begins to speak. At first, it may appear as a fleeting thought, a subtle recognition in the middle of a conversation, or a moment of stillness when you are alone. It says something simple, almost unsettling in its certainty. This is not right. You may try to dismiss it, just as you dismissed the earlier signs. You may tell yourself that relationships are difficult, that no situation is perfect, that walking away is too extreme. But this voice does not disappear. It returns again and again, each time a little clearer. What makes this voice different is that it does not come from fear. It comes from alignment. It is the part of you that has remained untouched by confusion, by manipulation, by emotional exhaustion. While other aspects of your psyche have been pulled in different directions, this part has been quietly observing, waiting for you to become still enough to hear it. Psychologically, this can be understood as the reemergence of the authentic self. The deeper structure of your being begins to reassert itself when the imbalance becomes too great to sustain. It no longer seeks to adapt or negotiate. It seeks truth, and truth, when fully realized, carries a certain finality. You may notice that this voice does not offer complex explanations. It does not engage in endless analysis. It presents a simple directive: step away, not out of anger, not out of weakness, but out of recognition. Recognition of what has been consistently shown to you, and what can no longer be ignored without cost. This is often the final warning, not because it is the last sign, but because it is the clearest. Everything before it could be questioned. This cannot, and the moment you hear that voice and choose to ignore it, you are not lacking information. You are abandoning yourself. Because when your deepest truth tells you to walk away, and you stay, you are not preserving the connection. You are betraying your own becoming.